By the late medieval period, torture had reached its most refined and terrifying form. Not louder, not bloodier, but more final. Authorities had learned something crucial over centuries of screams and confessions. Pain alone was not enough. The body could endure more than expected. The mind could fracture in unpredictable ways. Some victims confessed to everything, others to nothing at all. So the final generation of medieval torture devices was designed with a single principle in mind. There must be no recovery. Not physical, not social, not spiritual. One of the most feared devices of this era did not look violent at first glance: the cage of despair. Unlike the hanging gibbets used for public display, this cage was often kept indoors or in tower chambers, narrow, upright, barely wider than the human body. The victim was locked inside, standing. They could not sit, they could not fully straighten, they could not fall without being caught by the bars. Hours passed, then days. Muscles failed first, then circulation. Swelling followed. Numbness turned into agony. Sleep deprivation took over. Hallucinations came quietly. Voices, shadows, memories replayed endlessly. Some prisoners began confessing to crimes that never happened, begging for punishment just to end the waiting. And when the cage was opened, those who survived often could not walk. Their bodies had forgotten how. But medieval torture did not rely on endurance alone. Some devices targeted a single, irreversible moment: the executioner's certainty. One such device was the head crusher, a metal frame fitted around the skull, a screw mechanism positioned above. The lower bar rested beneath the chin, the upper plate pressed down. Slowly. Teeth cracked first, then the jaw fractured. Eyes bulged from their sockets. Eventually, the skull itself collapsed. Death came swiftly compared to other devices, but not instantly. The head crusher was often reserved for final punishment, used after confessions were secured. It was not about information. It was about closure. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of medieval torture was not the devices themselves. It was how normal they became. Records show towns budgeting for torture equipment repairs. Iron spikes replaced, ropes reinforced, wooden frames strengthened. Pain required maintenance. Executioners trained apprentices, fathers taught sons, techniques passed down like crafts, and the victims came from everywhere. Peasants accused of theft, nobles suspected of treason, women accused of witchcraft, clergy accused of heresy. Torture did not discriminate; it obeyed authority. Some of the most infamous cases reveal how easily anyone could fall into this system. In 1431, Joan of Arc was subjected to prolonged imprisonment and threat of torture, not always applied physically, but psychologically. She was shown instruments, threatened with the rack, pressured relentlessly. Her execution was not the result of a single act of cruelty, but an entire system built on fear. And that is the truth many modern minds struggle to accept. Medieval torture was not the work of monsters. It was the work of governments, of courts, of laws. And as the medieval era slowly gave way to the early modern period, cracks began to appear. Scholars questioned confessions obtained under pain. Doctors observed that torture produced unreliable results. Philosophers argued that truth could not be forced from flesh. But systems do not collapse overnight. Torture lingered. Devices were modified. names changed, justifications rewritten. Even as public executions declined, private interrogation rooms remained, and the legacy endured. Scars passed down through families, stories whispered, warnings embedded in folklore. The medieval world may have ended, but its methods echoed far longer. Toward the end of the medieval world, something subtle began to change. There was no announcement, no decree that declared suffering obsolete. Instead, doubt crept in quietly. Judges began to notice something disturbing. People confessed to impossible crimes, to being in two places at once, to witchcraft without knowledge of spells, to heresies they could not even describe. Pain did not reveal truth. It manufactured it. Physicians, still primitive by modern standards but observant, started documenting how bodies reacted under extreme stress. They noticed memory collapse, confusion, hallucinations. A tortured mind would say anything. This realization did not end torture immediately, but it weakened its authority. Courts began to restrict its use. Only certain crimes, only certain circumstances, only after evidence, though evidence itself was often shaped by fear. Some regions required the presence of officials to monitor torture. Others limited how many times a victim could be tortured, though loopholes existed. Rest periods reset the count. Different devices were considered separate acts. Pain adapted faster than law. But the image of torture was changing. Public executions began to decline, not because people became kinder, but because they became uncomfortable. Crowds that once cheered began to turn away. Children fainted. Spectators vomited. Rumors spread that excessive cruelty invited divine punishment. Fear turned inward. And with that shift, torture moved further from public squares into private chambers, behind walls, behind doors, out of sight. This made torture more dangerous, not less. Without witnesses, accountability vanished. Interrogation became quieter, more psychological. Sleep deprivation replaced the rack. Isolation replaced the wheel. Threats replaced the blade. The body still suffered, but the scars were harder to see. This transition marked the end of medieval torture as spectacle, but not as practice. Devices were dismantled. Some were melted down. Others were stored, forgotten. Or so it seemed. Because pain, once normalized, does not disappear. It evolves. In the centuries that followed, torture would be rebranded. It would be called enhanced interrogation, correction, reform. The tools changed. The logic did not. The medieval belief that suffering reveals truth refused to die. Even as Enlightenment thinkers argued against it, states found new justifications: national security, moral purification, order. The dungeon became the cell. The rack became restraint. The Iron Maiden became isolation. And the psychological principles remained eerily familiar. Fear breaks resistance. Pain produces compliance. Control comes through helplessness. The medieval world left behind its iron and wood, but not its understanding of the human breaking point. And that is perhaps the most unsettling legacy of all. Because when we study medieval torture, we like to believe we are looking at something alien, something barbaric, something safely buried in the past. But the truth is quieter, more disturbing. These devices did not come from madness. They came from logic, from systems, from people who believed they were right. And that belief, the certainty that pain is justified, has never truly vanished. By the time torture was formally outlawed in many regions, it had already transformed. Invisible scars replaced visible ones. Fear learned to whisper instead of scream. And yet echoes remained. Museums preserved the devices, iron maidens behind glass, wheels mounted silently, thumb screws resting harmlessly on velvet. Visitors stare. Some laugh nervously. Some turn away. Few imagine what it felt like. The weight of the room, the smell of iron, the sound of ropes tightening, the knowledge that no one was coming. And this is where the story must slow, because the end of medieval torture is not a clean ending. It is a fading, a long shadow stretching forward. The silence that replaced medieval screams did not mean peace. It meant control had learned to whisper. Long after the wheels stopped turning in town squares, the mindset that created them remained embedded in authority. Torture had proven something terrifyingly useful. Fear worked faster than reason. And once that lesson is learned, it is never unlearned. In late medieval prisons, records show a shift. Fewer iron devices, fewer public executions, but far more prolonged detentions. Cells grew smaller. Windows disappeared. Light itself became a tool. Prisoners were left alone for weeks, sometimes months. No sound, no human voice, just the drip of water, the scrape of rats, the slow erosion of time. This was not kindness, this was efficiency, because medieval interrogators had learned something the devices alone could not teach. The body breaks loudly, the mind breaks quietly, and a quiet prisoner does not inspire revolt. They do not become martyrs, they simply vanish. In some regions, torture chambers were repurposed rather than destroyed. Racks dismantled, but pulleys left in ceilings. Wheels broken apart, but iron bars reused. The architecture of suffering remained. Walls absorbed screams. Floors absorbed blood. Even when devices were gone, the rooms remembered. People felt it. Guards refused certain posts. Prisoners begged not to be taken below. Locals avoided castles after dark. Folklore grew around these places, not ghosts with chains, but presences. Heavy air, oppressive silence, a sense that pain had soaked into stone itself. And perhaps that is why medieval torture never truly ended. It simply lost its name. By the early modern period, interrogators began using what they called softening. Sleep deprivation, standing for days, cold water exposure, hooding. None of these required devices, none left obvious marks, but all produced the same results: confession, compliance, submission. The medieval world had discovered that pain did not need iron, it needed helplessness. That knowledge spread quietly across borders. And yet, when people today imagine medieval torture, they return again and again to the devices: the Iron Maiden, the rack, the wheel. Because objects are easier to condemn than ideas. We can lock iron behind glass and say, we are better now. But are we? Medieval torture was justified by belief. Belief in divine order, belief in absolute authority, belief that truth could be forced from flesh. Modern systems justify suffering differently. Security, stability, prevention. The words change, the logic does not. And this is where the story must slow further, because the real horror of medieval torture is not how much pain it caused, it is how reasonable it once seemed. Judges believed they were protecting society. Priests believed they were saving souls. Executioners believed they were performing necessary work. No one thought themselves evil, and that is what allowed the devices to exist. Medieval torture chambers were not chaotic places. They were organized, tools arranged carefully, records kept meticulously, payments issued regularly. Pain was bureaucratic, and bureaucracy does not disappear easily. It evolves. Long after torture was officially condemned, its logic seeped into institutions, prisons, asylums, interrogation rooms. The idea that breaking a person could fix a problem remained stubbornly alive. Which is why medieval torture still fascinates us, not because it is foreign, but because it is familiar. Because somewhere deep inside we recognize the impulse, the desire to control, to force order, to make uncertainty scream. And that recognition is uncomfortable. So we return to the devices. We study their spikes, their screws, their frames. We tell ourselves the horror lived there, in iron, in wood, in machines. But machines do nothing on their own. They wait, just like the devices waited in medieval chambers, silent, ready. And even now, as this story continues, that silence stretches, because there are still more devices, more methods, more forgotten variations, regional designs, hybrid punishments, unrecorded experiments that never made it into court logs. Executioners were inventive. When a method failed, they adjusted. When a victim survived too long, they refined. Pain was iterative. And in the shadows of history, there are devices whose names were never written down, only their effects. Crushed hands, blind eyes, voices lost forever. People who walked away alive, but not whole. People who became warnings without words. And the medieval world watched, learned, accepted. The story does not end here. It cannot, because as long as fear remains useful, the logic of torture remains nearby, dormant, waiting. The longer one studies medieval torture, the clearer it becomes that the devices themselves were only the visible surface. Beneath them existed habits, routines, unspoken rules passed from one generation of authority to the next. In many regions, executioners were required to swear oaths, not to mercy, but to precision. Sloppiness was punished. Killing too quickly was considered failure. Allowing escape was unforgivable. Pain had to be measured. That is why executioners learned to read bodies the way sailors read weather. Skin color, breathing rhythm, eye movement. These signs determined when to pause, when to continue, when to stop just short of death. Visual reenactment suggestion. A gloved hand hovering inches above a restrained chest, feeling breath rise and fall. In German territories, records describe executioners practicing on animal carcasses to understand joint resistance. In France, some were apprenticed under surgeons, not to heal, but to avoid fatal mistakes. The body was a mechanism, and like all mechanisms, it could be studied. This mindset produced regional variations of torture devices, adaptations tailored to climate, materials, and cultural beliefs. In colder regions, exposure was favored. Victims were stripped and left restrained in open courtyards during winter nights. Frostbite did the work slowly. Fingers blackened, toes hardened and fell away. The cold did not scream, it whispered. In southern regions, heat became the instrument. Sun exposure combined with restraint, dehydration, salt rubbed into wounds, not to infect, but to amplify sensation. Pain followed the environment. Because torture was never just about force, it was about using what was already there. Even architecture became a tool. Low ceilings forced prisoners to hunch, narrow corridors disoriented, echoing chambers magnified every sound. Some torture rooms were designed so screams traveled upward into churches, courts, living quarters. Others were built to swallow sound completely. Both were intentional. And then there were the survivors, not the lucky ones, the damaged ones. People who walked out of chambers carrying pain with them for decades. Chronic dislocations, permanent tremors, voices reduced to whispers. Their testimonies are fragmented, not because they were unreliable, but because memory itself had been altered. Pain reshapes recollection. Many survivors could not remember the order of events, only sensations. Cold iron, rope burn, the smell of sweat and rust. They spoke of time dissolving. Minutes felt like days, days like lifetimes. Some said the worst part was not the device, but the waiting. Being led past instruments, hearing others scream, knowing their turn was approaching. Anticipation hollowed them out. That is why medieval torture relied so heavily on delay. Executioners often left victims restrained but untouched for hours, sometimes overnight. The mind filled the silence with terror far more vivid than any physical act. And once fear had settled deeply enough, the device barely mattered. This technique became so effective that some courts recorded confessions obtained before torture officially began. The threat was enough. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If fear alone could break people, why were the devices still used? The answer lies not in necessity, but in reassurance. Authority needed to see its power. Iron provided certainty. A rack did not argue. A wheel did not hesitate. A screw did not question orders. Devices removed doubt. They allowed those in power to distance themselves emotionally. The device did the work, not the hand. This emotional distance explains why torture persisted even as its effectiveness was questioned. It was never just about information, it was about control, about demonstrating that resistance was futile. And so torture adapted, not vanished. By the late medieval to early modern transition, written manuals began describing torture as a last resort, yet listing it in detail. Contradiction became standard, outlawed in principle, practiced in reality. And as centuries passed, torture retreated further into abstraction. Numbers replaced names. Confessions became documents. Pain became a line item. The medieval dungeon dissolved into the modern institution, but the emotional blueprint remained intact: fear, isolation, helplessness. Which is why medieval torture still echoes so loudly, because it did not fail, it succeeded too well. It taught systems how to break people efficiently, and knowledge, once learned, does not unlearn itself. As this narration continues, there is no need to rush. The medieval world moved slowly. Suffering unfolded over hours, over days, over lifetimes. So this story does the same, lingering, circling, returning to the same truths from different angles. Iron rusts, wood rots, but ideas persist. And somewhere in forgotten basements, beneath repurposed buildings, behind sealed doors, stone rooms still exist. Empty, silent, waiting. Time moves differently inside this history. Not forward in a straight line, but outward, spreading, echoing, repeating itself in quieter forms. As medieval torture became less visible, it became more internalized. Authorities learned that a person does not need to be broken in front of a crowd to be broken forever. Isolation could do what iron once did. Cells were redesigned. Some were built so narrow that prisoners could not fully extend their arms. Others were shaped irregularly, confusing the sense of space. Corners disappeared. Straight lines vanished. The mind depends on structure. Take that away, and it begins to dissolve. Visual reenactment suggestion. A candle flame flickering inside a misshapen stone cell, shadows bending unnaturally. In certain prisons, prisoners were rotated between cells every few days, not for hygiene, not for safety, for disorientation. Just as they began to recognize the sound of one room, they were moved. The medieval understanding of torture had expanded beyond devices. It now included environment. Even silence became calibrated. Guards were instructed not to speak, not to answer questions, not to acknowledge prisoners as human. A voice ignored long enough begins to doubt its own existence, and that doubt is powerful, stronger than chains. Some prisoners began talking to walls, others to insects. Some stopped speaking entirely. When they were finally brought before interrogators, their voices sounded distant, even to themselves. Confessions came easily then, not because they were true, but because they were something to fill the void. This is why medieval torture systems rarely collapsed under moral pressure. They adapted too well. When one method became unacceptable, another replaced it, less visible, less dramatic, but equally effective. Pain learned restraint, and restraint learned patience. There are accounts of prisoners who were never touched, never struck, never restrained. They were simply left alone with uncertainty. Days without information, weeks without answers, months without knowing if they were forgotten or deliberately ignored. The human mind needs resolution. Without it, fear grows inward. Visual reenactment suggestion. A candle scratched into stone, marking stopping abruptly. And yet, despite all of this, resistance existed. Quiet resistance, internal resistance. Some prisoners learned to detach, to retreat inward. They focused on breathing, on memory, on repetition of prayers or phrases, not to escape, but to survive.
These individuals confused executioners. They did not react as expected. They did not beg. They did not scream. They endured. And endurance frightened authority, because endurance suggested limits, and limits challenged power. So systems adjusted again. They added unpredictability, interrogations at random hours, sudden movement, abrupt changes in treatment, kindness followed by cruelty, cruelty followed by kindness. The mind could not adapt. Consistency is something humans lean on. Remove it, and stability collapses. This technique, later studied formally in modern psychology, was already understood intuitively in medieval chambers. Break expectation, break rhythm, break hope. Devices were no longer the center, they were the punctuation, a reminder of what could happen, not what must happen. And so medieval torture became something more disturbing than brutality. It became subtle. It became normalized. It became procedural. That is why records from the period often read coldly. Subject questioned, resistance noted, measures applied, confession obtained. No mention of screams, no description of fear, just outcomes. Pain reduced to administration. And that reduction allowed people to live with it, to go home afterward, to eat dinner, to sleep. Executioners were not always haunted figures. Many were respected craftsmen. They paid taxes, they raised families, they attended church. This normality is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all. Torture did not require cruelty of character, only obedience. And obedience thrives in systems, which is why medieval torture still matters, because systems have not vanished, they have only become quieter, more polished, less obvious. The dungeon has been replaced by rooms with clean walls, the rack by restraints labeled safety, the wheel by confinement measured in years. The logic persists. Fear produces compliance. Suffering enforces order. Control justifies itself. And this story continues not because we enjoy darkness, but because understanding it removes its disguise. As long as pain can be rationalized, it will return in some form, not always with iron, not always with blood, but always with the same belief that breaking a human can fix a problem. The medieval world believed that, deeply, sincerely, and that belief shaped centuries. So we linger here, not at the end, but in the long middle, where systems hum quietly, where silence replaces screams, where the devices are gone, but the rooms remain, still, empty, waiting.